Welcome to the Perrysburg Podcast, episode 50. I'm your host and Perrysburg resident, Kim Newlove. I am celebrating a milestone today, and I am so excited. The Perrysburg Podcast started 1 year ago in July of 2023, and today is my podcast anniversary show for year one. Gratitude first. There are a whole bunch of people that I need to thank, and those thank yous are coming up right now. Thank you for listening. This podcast would not be successful without an audience. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing this podcast with others. Thank you to my guests for being on the show. Lorenzo Melcher, my pastor, Pastor Mark Wentz, Laura Winters, Richard Baranowski. So many people, thank you so much for being on the Perrysburg Podcast. Thank you to everyone who has helped me with the podcast, like Marie Dunn, the Public Information Officer at the City of Perrysburg, Andy and Marv over at Perrysburg Township Maintenance Department. So many people have helped me from so many different parts of Perrysburg. Thank you so much for helping me with this podcast. Thank you for subscribing to the email newsletter, too. I have never had an email newsletter before. This is my first one, and I think I've got something like 56 subscribers at this point. If you're one of them, thank you for subscribing to the email newsletter. And thank you to my family. I probably should have put them first. Family first, right? My family allows me the time to publish weekly episodes. I have a lot to be thankful for, especially my very understanding husband and 2 kids. I appreciate you all, listeners, guests, family, everyone. Thank you. Now I'd like to switch gears here and talk about when and why I started this podcast, some stats, and what's coming up in year number 2. History first. I started the Perrysburg Podcast on July 2nd, 2023. There was a trailer episode. That was episode number 1. Then I started publishing weekly episodes every Friday in August. I plan to continue the weekly episodes for the next 2 years. More on that in just a minute. What made me want to start a podcast about Perrysburg in the first place, you may be wondering. When Perrysburg was featured in Ohio Magazine's Best Hometowns issue in 2022, I got the idea to start an informational podcast about Perrysburg. I wanted to help anyone who was interested in making Perrysburg their hometown. When my husband and I were shopping for a house in Perrysburg back in 2006, we didn't know much about living here. We grew up in the Pemberville Bowling Green area. We went to the University of Toledo. We had relatives in Perrysburg, but we didn't really know much about living here. I wondered, what's in Perrysburg and why do people like to live here? Other than talking to other residents or visiting town, I didn't really have a good way to learn about living in Perrysburg. A podcast would have been very helpful to me, especially since I didn't have a lot of time on my hands back in 2006. I was working as a pharmacist at Walgreens in the south end of Toledo, and my husband and I had 2 toddlers ages 1 and 3. With house shopping on top of working and helping the boys grow and reach their full potential, we were beyond busy back in 2006. A podcast would have allowed me to listen and learn as I did housework and drove to and from work. I created the podcast that I needed back in 2006. When my family moved to Perrysburg in 2007, I learned about this town, but it was slowly. I learned by living here. It took me months. It took me a good year to find all the good playgrounds, hear about the fireworks, the parades, the festivals, all the things that only happen once a year, and then get connected to a mom's group. That was huge. I heard about it from a friend of mine who already lived in Perrysburg, but I had to show up to the meetings, build the relationships, and all that takes time. Even though my family and I have lived in Perrysburg for almost 17 years, it's been almost 17 full years, almost beginning year 18 here, I still don't know everything about this town. I am constantly curious about what brings other people to Perrysburg and why they like living here too. Here in the year 2024, I am still learning about Perrysburg. Who's the audience for the Perrysburg Podcast? The Perrysburg Podcast serves three groups of people. They are the prospective, new, and current Perrysburg, Ohio residents. The prospective residents are like me back in 2006 when I was looking for a house. The new residents are like me in 2007 when I was brand new here. And the current residents are anyone who's been here longer than a year, like me. In general, we talk about what's in Perrysburg and why people like to live here. In summary, although I started the Perrysburg Podcast to help my former self back in 2006, the podcast actually serves three audiences: prospective, new, and current Perrysburg, Ohio residents. One thing many listeners may not know about this podcast is something that I hinted to earlier in this episode. This podcast was born with an expiration date. Did you know that? I would like to publish weekly episodes for 3 years. Then I'll decide the fate of this podcast. My other podcast, which is called the Pharmacist's Voice Podcast, is a business tool for my small business. It's been running for more than 4.5 years. It works great, and there is no end in sight. I am a professional female voice actor and podcast host who also happens to be a pharmacist, hence the name The Pharmacist's Voice. I use the Pharmacist's Voice podcast for branding, marketing, networking, and relationship building. It is a business tool. The Perrysburg Podcast, on the other hand, is a service project. In honor of these three groups that I serve, I plan to run the Perrysburg Podcast for 3 years. That's 1 year in honor of each of the three groups. When time's up in July of 2026, I'll reevaluate if my audience wants me to continue, or if I want to continue, or if I want this podcast to come to an end. Stay tuned. The 3rd anniversary episode of this podcast will announce the future of the podcast. In the meantime, I have tons of ideas for episodes, and I am so looking forward to sharing some of those ideas with you at the end of this episode. Let's move on to stats next. For my other show, the Pharmacist's Voice Podcast, I have done a podcast anniversary episode every January for the last 4 years. I am a pharmacist by training, and I love data. So I share stats from my pharmacy podcast on each anniversary show. If you like data too, check out these stats for the Perrysburg Podcast. I have to bring something that worked for my other podcast to this podcast. Enjoy. As of July 2nd, 2024, this podcast has 1,470 downloads. After episode 20, I experienced exponential growth compared to the first 20 episodes, and I think that's because I started a newsletter, I started advertising on the Perrysburg, Ohio Facebook group, and I started getting people sharing the episodes on their social media. I look forward to seeing how the stats change over the next 2 years because I hope to add an Instagram page at some point in the next year or two here for the podcast, and get the word out with more advertising. I'll report back to you about download numbers next July. Next up, how many solo shows and how many interview shows have I published? The Perrysburg Podcast has 50 episodes, including this one. 30 have been solo shows and 20 have been interview shows. That is 60% solo shows and 40% interview shows. The top 3 countries that download the Perrysburg Podcast are the United States, Canada, and France. In that order, by the way: USA, Canada, and France. The vast majority of downloads come from the United States, of course. Canada and France have a similar number of downloads. The Perrysburg Podcast has downloads in 10 countries at this point, 10 countries, and the one on the list that surprised me the most was Costa Rica. I'm all the way over here in Ohio, and someone in little old Costa Rica is listening to me talk about Perrysburg. That's pretty cool. No matter which country you are in, thank you for listening. Moving on, which episodes have the most downloads on the podcast players and on YouTube? Before I get to the lists, I just want to mention that there is no overlap. I mean that there are no episodes that made the top 5 on the podcast players that also made the top 5 on YouTube. Both of these lists are completely different. Now here's a list of the 5 most downloaded episodes on the podcast players, starting with the 5th one on the list first. Number 5 is episode 46. Episode 46 is about my Podcasting 101 classes. Number 4 is episode 45. That features Perrysburg resident Laura Winters. Number 3 is episode 34, which features Pastor Mark Wentz from Lutheran Church of the Master. That's my pastor. And the next 2 are tied for the number 1 spot, which means there's no number 2. Tied for the most downloaded episode in year 1 of the Perrysburg Podcast is episode 35, which was about spring brush pickup, featuring Perrysburg's Public Information Officer Marie Dunn, and episode 40, which is my interview with Pastor Dan Gildner. Again, the most downloaded episodes so far are the brush pickup episode and my interview with Pastor Dan. Now let's talk about downloads on the Perrysburg Podcast's YouTube channel. Each episode that is syndicated to the podcast players is also syndicated to YouTube. I don't know if you knew that. The Perrysburg Podcast has a YouTube channel. You can find it by going to perrysburgpodcast.com and clicking on the YouTube logo. In case you're wondering, what's the difference, Kim? What does that look like if you've never been there? A thumbnail image of the episode artwork for each episode is paired with the same exact audio that you hear on the podcast players. But I also have some video episodes on YouTube. How do you tell the difference? Look at the artwork. The audio-only episodes have an image of some headphones, and the video episodes have an image of a YouTube logo. Piece of cake, you should be able to tell them apart. Please note that none of my audio-only episodes made the top 5 most downloaded episodes in year 1. The top 5 are all videos on the YouTube stats here. I hope that makes sense. Let's start with number 5 first. Number 5 is episode 15, which is about Hood Park. Number 4 is episode 18, which is about the Norma Stark Garden and Labyrinth. Number 3 is about episode 25, which is about W.W. Knight Nature Preserve. Number 2 is episode 22, which features Richard Baranowski and the walking tour of Louisiana Avenue. And number 1 is episode 32, featuring Brian Miller from MommyRiverWalleyeRun.com. In that episode, we talk about walleye. Stats are fun, aren't they? I think it's interesting that the most downloaded episodes on YouTube are different from the most downloaded episodes on the podcast players, and there's no overlap. None of the episodes that made it to the top 5 on the podcast players made it to the top 5 on YouTube. Stats are fun. All good things must come to an end. That ends the stats about the most downloaded episodes, and that does it for the topic of stats in general. We talked about download numbers, country information, and most downloaded episodes. Let's move on to what's next on my production schedule. I have really enjoyed this series that popped up in year 1 of this podcast. Some of the series that I have published include the Parks series, interviews with Perrysburg residents about what brought them to town and why they like to live here, interviews with Perrysburg faith community leaders, and interviews with the Ability Center of Greater Toledo's staff. I have really enjoyed all of those series, and I plan to do more episodes in those series in year 2 of the Perrysburg Podcast. I would also like to do individual episodes on other topics. I have a list of 15 topics to start with, and I will share that list with you now. Number 1, the Perrysburg Boat Club and the 3 public boat launches. Number 2, the Perrysburg Area Senior Center. Number 3, preschools in Perrysburg. Number 4, the Perrysburg Maumee Bridge. Number 5, ice cream shops in Perrysburg. Number 6, coffee shops. Number 7, the Perrysburg Slow Rollers. That's a group of people that bicycle around town. I would like to try that some Monday night at 7. I understand they meet at Vito's Pizza. Number 8, the Fort Meigs YMCA. Number 9, the 577 Foundation. Number 10, Fort Meigs Battlefield. Number 11, Gathering Volumes Bookstore. Number 12, Public Transportation in Perrysburg. Number 13, the Monarch Grief Center, and an interview with the executive director, Tim Polakowski. That will probably be around Thanksgiving time. Number 14 is fall fun activities like Pete's Pumpkins and Gwen's Gourds. And number 15 is pickleball, a fun one to end on. If you can connect me with a good person to talk to about each of those 15 topics, please reach out. My email address is kim@perrysburgpodcast.com. I look forward to publishing the next 52 episodes of the Perrysburg Podcast, including that list of 15 plus the 4 series I mentioned. That's a great list, but that is not necessarily the order in which the episodes will be published. That's all I've got for you today. Thank you for joining me for my first podcast anniversary episode here on the Perrysburg Podcast. I hope you enjoyed hearing about the history of this podcast, stats, and what's coming up. To find the show notes for this episode, go to perrysburgpodcast.com and select episode 50. What's in the show notes today? In the show notes, you'll find a link to Ohio Magazine's Best Hometowns issue from 2022 featuring Perrysburg, a link to sign up for the email list for this podcast, a link to the YouTube channel for this podcast, the anniversary episodes for my other podcast, the Pharmacist's Voice podcast, and more. Everything you need is on perrysburgpodcast.com. If you know someone who would like this episode, please share it with them. Celebrations are meant to be shared. And if you like this podcast, please subscribe to or follow the Perrysburg Podcast on your favorite podcast player and YouTube to get each new episode right when it comes out. Thanks for listening today. I will talk to you next Friday. Next Friday, July 12th, is my birthday. I will be 46 years old, and the episode will be about Milestone Park.